I know there's something better down the road. We need to find a place where we are safe. We walk into that which we cannot yet see.
Hello, and welcome to Washington Post Live. I'm Robin Givhan, Senior Critic-at-Large for the Washington Post. And today we're continuing our series on race in America, and my guest is the author and poet Elizabeth Alexander. She is also currently the president of the Mellon Foundation, which has an endowment of over $9 billion. I'd also like to remind our audience that we would love for you to join the conversation, so please tweet your questions and comments to the handle PostLive. And now it's my great pleasure to welcome Elizabeth Alexander.
Hello, Robin. I'm so glad to be with you.
Well, it's great to have you back here. I wanted to start in right away with the focus of your book, because the death of Trayvon Martin has been now 10 years, but sadly there have been other searing deaths since then. I'm wondering why you focused on Trayvon and why you called it the Trayvon Generation.
Well, I think that what we know, sadly, is that race-based violence against Black people in particular is a tradition that is as old as the country itself. I think that if we look back to, let's say, the 1950s and the death of Emmett Till, when he was killed in Money, Mississippi, that was something that happened regularly. But what made the story different, why we remember Emmett Till, is that his mother brought his body to Chicago, kept the casket open, had people come through the church, and then the photograph of this killed child was in Jet magazine. So the world knew who Emmett Till was, and some called him the sacrificial lamb of the civil rights movement. Some thought of that as an inaugural moment in the civil rights movement. So with Trayvon Martin, tragically, there are Black and brown children on either side of him on the timeline, murdered by George Zimmerman in 2012. Hunted is really the only way to put it, coming from the store buying candy. And then a year later, when George Zimmerman was acquitted of murder, I think that we saw a galvanizing moment. We saw Black Lives Matter formed after that. We saw an enough is enough moment. Sadly, we are still dealing with all of these murders, all of this violence and vulnerability, and racism as an unsolved American problem. So I think when I talk about the Trayvon generation, I talk about the young people who were, coming of age in the last 10 years, even a little bit before that, with a steady diet of seeing this violence recorded on their phones. And I wanted to think about what they are dealing with, their trauma, their vulnerability, and also to think about what it means to love them and encourage them and listen to their culture and offer them something that moves them towards freedom.
Throughout the book, there's incredible artwork, but in particular, there's some photography of Dawood Bey, Martina and Rhonda. This particular one is called. And I'm curious, why was it important for you to actually show members of the Trayvon generation?
Well, I think, and to describe the way that art works in the book as a whole, I wanted it to be a very particular reading experience, so that as you were reading the words, you were also absorbing this brilliant, brilliant art, that it wasn't necessarily literal and illustrative. It was contrapuntal in conversation, that you could look just at the artwork, that you could come back to it and look at it with the words. So I wanted it to be a very special kind of reading experience. Martina and Rhonda, these young people who in large format, that photograph by Dawood Bey is in very large format. And he did a series of young people in Chicago. They're very intimate pictures. I think that breaking of the frame shows us the complexity within our young people. We need to listen to them to understand all of those pieces, if you will, that we see in that photograph. I think that also the resilience that's in that photograph is that even though the images are fractured, they nonetheless form a coherent whole. And I think also what's important about the two young people in the picture is that they are together a community, together a generation in intimate space moving forward.
I mean, that's such a, I think, an important word to describe so much of the book, intimate. I mean, there's really such a conversation and and it's quite revelatory about your own thoughts and concerns about your sons. And one of the things that you write is that every Black mother I know is exhausted in her own way. I mean, how did being a mother sort of drive some of the narrative in the book?
Well, my sons are now 22 and 23, and there are many pieces of me, but being their mother is the one thing I have to be forever, right? So I think that I would add to being a mother of these extraordinary young people that I was a college professor for over 3 decades. So the generation of young people, late teens to early 20s, that's my specialty. Those are the kids that I've loved and known and listened to and taught and shared culture with, and gotten them through crises and listened to their concerns for a very, very, very long time. Every Black mother I know is exhausted. I wrote that, and it feels like the resonant truth. In the image in the book by Elizabeth Catlett called "The Torture of Mothers," where you see the head of a Black woman, and in a bubble inside of it is a young Black man who in a pool of blood. And so that sense that there's never a corner of our brain, to be literal about the image, that isn't preoccupied. Because when you see, and not that it matters that these children are beautiful, but when you see the face of a Trayvon Martin, you see the face of a Tamir Rice. Let's just go through the names of these children. Tamir Rice playing outside a gazebo in a public park, 12 years old. Someone saw that as a predator. Someone's eyes cast that stereotype and dehumanization onto him. And my mother's eyes, I can't see that. And I want everyone to look at our children as though all of our children belong to all of us.
Wow. I mean, in talking about this generation, you underscore the fact that the violence has been in many ways very close to them because they have been able to witness it, through digitally, through their cell phones, through sadly live streams even. I mean, the past generations also lived with violence, but I mean, how do you see the proximity that up close, that cell phone relationship having an impact and sort of changing the way that they've experienced violence?
Well, I think that if you look at technologies over time, to go back to Emmett Till and Jet Magazine, Jet Magazine in 1955 was the most effective technology for Black people that there was, right? I mean, Jet Magazine was in so many homes, and that was a way that we could get the news. If you looked at Jet Magazine, you would be in intimate space. You would be in your home, maybe you'd be in the barbershop or the beauty shop. You'd be in a place where you could talk with other Black people about what it is you were seeing. You could process it together. Then let's move forward to another emblematic moment. The videotape, George Holliday's videotape of the police beating of Rodney King in the early 1990s. I think what's different about that is that, we weren't even able to record things on our cell phones at that time. So it was very unusual that we had videotaped evidence of that. And Rodney King was not a child. It was horrifying. I mean, I gasp whenever I've written about that video, that as well, and that moment of traumatization in our culture as well. But I think that repetition does something different. I think that your cell phone that you can look at when you're on the school bus before you get home, that you can look at when you're under the covers in your bed, that you see not once, not twice, but infinite numbers of time, that is literally, touching your body when you watch it. I think that's actually quite important. And so if you think, about the scenes that we might turn from in movies, right? When something terrible is happening and it's hard to watch it. Imagine being formative and seeing something like this over and over again. Imagine, as I write about in the book, Darnella Frazier, 17 years old, videotaping these 4 police officers in the act of murder and aiding and abetting the murder of George Floyd. Those long minutes we know about because a 17-year-old girl went on a routine run to the corner store with her little cousin and came upon this and somehow had the presence of mind and the courage, unimaginable courage, I think, actually, to tape it. But she then the next day and subsequent to that used the word traumatized.
Bringing her up just sort of reminds me that, much of the book does sort of focus on young Black sons. And I'm wondering if you see a difference between the way in which young Black boys, young Black men absorb that kind of violence and the way that it might impact young girls.
Well, I mean, we have to think about all of our children, and of course, also our girls and Black women are not immune to violence. So I talk about the terrible film that we saw of the Black girl in the colorful bikini. I think she was 13 years old at a pool party. That the police broke up and that a policeman kneeled on her back. She feared for her life. It's terrifying to watch that. So I do talk about instances where girls are violated as well. I think that we have to also think about all of the different stereotypes and their particularity that still apply. I mean, I take us back to the fact that we were brought to this country as property. We were brought here to build and work to death and reproduce more property for the purpose of building the wealth of others. I mean, that's not hyperbole, that's the simple fact. Right. We were legally classified as 3/5 human beings. I think in order to do violence to people, you have to dehumanize them first. And, there is just a very, very, very long history of, dehumanizing Black people that I would argue with our culture. I mean, that's where I have hope that culture and history and critical thinking and art are a way that we can be seen in our full humanity. But it's profound to me when I think back of, the famous image in the 19th century of the slave pleading for his humanity, making the case for his humanity, that in a different moment, that is still something that hasn't been all the way resolved.
I was going to ask you about this a little bit later, but in bringing up the question of humanity, it reminds me of the essay that you wrote in the part of the book that deals with this question that was posed to, I believe it was W.B. Du Bois,
Du Bois. Mm-hmm.
about do Black people cry? Do they shed tears? And your assessment of that question was really that the person was asking, are Black people human? I mean, can you talk a little bit about that essay? I mean, it's incredibly
Yes.
moving and distressing.
Yes, well, in the early part of the 1900s, 1905, a researcher named Alvin Borquist wrote to W.E.B. Du Bois, at the time a PhD, a professor at Atlanta University, someone known for doing his research on Black people, and wrote very, very seriously, asking the question, "Does the Negro shed tears?" And very clinically wanted to know, if they do, for what reason, in what circumstances. But he didn't believe that Black people could cry. And, Du Bois answers back. I mean, first he very dryly says, the Negro sheds tears, and then went on from there. But I move in the chapter to images of Black men in particular, and back to a thread of your great question about Black girls and about gender. I think that, as we think about Black men and Black boys in particular, and the way in which the space of expressivity is sometimes something that is tamped down in our boys, when they're told to be a man and to keep your chin up, and be the man of the house, little man, boys don't cry, all of this kind of stuff. We have a lot to cry about. Those feelings, those emotions, and I talk about all the people on the stand, the Black men at Derek Chauvin's trial, the police officer who murdered George Floyd, the neighborhood elder, Philonise Williams, weeping, George Floyd's brother, weeping, George Floyd himself, weeping as his life was taken from him. It goes without saying, but the point is, the waters of our bodies, the involuntary reaction of crying or laughing, this is what human beings do. When we come onto this earth, how do we know everything is okay? We wait for the human baby to cry. So I thought that was something worth bringing forward.
Yeah, and just in talking about the gender issue as well. I mean, it continues on with the trope of the strong Black woman and
Yes.
her invulnerability and her strength in the face of oppression.
Well, and to that, you mentioned that, and so of course I have to say right now to invoke the extraordinary Judge Ketanji Brown Jackson, and just saying all my positive things right now. But what I thought was so extraordinary, I mean, she was treated with such profound disrespect, rhetorical violence, gender-based racism. I mean, it was really quite a display. But what I thought was so powerful is that the strong Black woman, right, we're not supposed to cry at work, right? And I was so moved and so glad that a tear fell when Senator Cory Booker lifted her up, shined a light on her accomplishments, asked the questions that were appropriate in this moment, and talked about how no one would steal the pride and the joy of this moment. That brought a tear to her eyes. And I was so happy to see that tear, because I think that, perhaps the final frontier of our freedom is, can we be fully expressive human beings, wherever we may be, and not have that evoke all other people's stereotypes.
One of the questions that we actually have that came in early, let's see, oh, did I lose it? There we are. It's from Carl Rudd in Maryland. And he was asking, how have social media and cell phone cameras affected the engagement of young people in racial and social justice initiatives? Just
Well,
to add to that, I wonder, have there been positive aspects to social media and to all of those cameras in mobilizing people, and how so?
for sure. I'm so glad for that question because I didn't mean to suggest that all of these repeated images mean cell phones are bad. It just means that that's where we are with the technology, and that's how it's used. I think that the connectivity of social media is a wonderful thing. I think that the accessibility of cell phones. I mean, everybody's got one. In the last 2 years of the COVID-19 pandemic and the attendant lockdowns, the way that, and particularly after the murder of George Floyd, with people in isolation, they were able to mobilize and go into the streets and raise their voices in protest. And that was because they were able to stay, connected in that particular way. I know that others have talked about Black Lives Matter and its moment, its the movements of the time, as being very much uh, effective and speedy because of how we've been able to communicate with each other. So I think that is very, very important and positive.
And as in the past, I mean, music, art have been instrumental in communicating concerns, issues, raising awareness. I want to take the opportunity to show a little bit more of the incredible art that
Great.
in the book. I mean, it ranges from Amy Sherald
Hmm.
to Kerry James Marshall, as well as I think we also have Jordan Castile. I mean, a really
Yes.
a wide range across generations. What is it about art, poetry, and their ability to communicate in a way that pure journalism doesn't?
Well, I mean, I think, artists are our seers and our seers, right? I mean, what we ask of our artists, of our poets, is that they go down into the darkness and bring back something human. With artists, writers, poets, the way that they practice their craft, the fact that the brilliant ones are rare, means that with that thing that they bring out, to be able to give it to us in a way that is as powerful as the art that you saw just now. I do believe, I've said this before, but I think that imagination is truly a superpower. I think that the ability to make human connection, to be able to understand the life of another, to be able to enter the world of another, to travel outside of ourselves with art and with poetry, to have understanding crystallized, especially in the word. Um, that's what we need from our artists and our poets. And I wanted to give that in abundance in this book. With those pictures that you just showed, and it makes me so happy to see them up there. Again, they're not directly illustrative of the book, but they themselves raise interesting questions. In the Amy Sherald, here is a Black cowboy. So
Mhm.
already we're, kind of challenged by a stereotype that is it turned on itself. Here is a Black man wearing the American flag. So, in this country where, sometimes our relationship to it can be ambivalent, we can critique it and love it at the same time. Though, that's the gift of Blackness, I think, is that kind of critical thinking. To the Kerry James Marshall, seeing the quotidian ways in our home spaces that we remember, even if we're not remembered in monuments and official spaces. So, that goes along with a conversation about driving in New Haven, Connecticut, and seeing how a community is wearing golden hoodies with the face of a young boy who was killed. They're remembering him on their bodies. And that is how we do. To look at the beautiful, beautiful Jordan Castile, Galen, that green, mysterious figure. human beings are not green, but does this raise interesting questions about race, about skin color, about the mysteries of who we are? You know, does that person just feel like that's who he is that day? And to be able to look at the beauty of a Black male nude without stereotype, simply to look at that beauty, I think is something that painting allows us to do.
I mean, so much of what you described really gets at understanding the nuances of our history to better understand who we are and where we are today. And yet, that is it's something that is quite controversial now. It's under assault to some degree. This idea of wanting to protect young people from difficult ideas. I mean, as an educator, as an artist, I mean, how do you see the capacity for young people to grapple with these tough and complex ideas?
Well, thank you for that question because I have proof. I mean, you know, decades of teaching mixed college classrooms, mixed race, mixed gender, mixed class, mixed sexuality, mixed experience, mixed places of the world, coming together to study African American culture because that's what I've taught. I see people come in the door one way and leave another. I see people angry about what they have been denied in their learning. I see people exhilarated by what they are given in the culture. I see people grappling with each other with the question of race. And you know, one of the things I think having a difficult racial conversation, like you won't die from it. And, you know, to see people work their way through um, uh, over and over, semester after semester after semester, for over 30 years. Yes, it's hard sometimes, but I know we can do it.
Well, we have only a couple minutes, and I would love to ask you if you can tell us of any particular writers or poets who inspire you. I think we have a sense of some of the artists visual artists who inspire you, but who should we be reading now?
Oh, well, I think I'll point you to some of the folks who I lift up in the book because they are very important to me. Always the poet Gwendolyn Brooks, her pithiness of language, and I think the way in which she's the one who reminds us with the poem "The Boy Died in My Alley" that all of our children belong to all of us. Lucille Clifton, our greatest, deepest poet, philosopher, I think, who in the poem, Won't You Celebrate With Me, says, every day something, won't you celebrate with me that every day something has tried to kill me and failed. You know, that sense of we can celebrate even as we are under siege, that our young people, you know, even as we think about vulnerability and trauma, they are mighty. They are dancing. They are thinking. They are in the street. They are in the classroom. They are working. They are going to show us the way. They are surviving. We are surviving. So I see that in Lucille Clifton. Natasha Trethewey, whose extraordinary poem about growing up in Mississippi and being taught as a child, Gone with the Wind was her history textbook. So the way in which Trethewey gets at the mythologies of who we are as a country and helps us take them apart. And then finally, another poet who I love, a young poet named Clint Smith, who is also a prose writer, also a scholar. And he has a poem where he talks about being with his precious young son in the store and having someone say, "Oh, he's so adorable," and thinking about what the future is like for that child. So those are, I urge you all to hasten to buy books by these poets.
Well, Elizabeth Alexander, thank you so much for joining us. It's been a pleasure. And
Thank
I
you
would
so
like to
much.
And I would like to thank everyone for listening today and for upcoming programs. Please go to WashingtonPostLive.com to register. And Thank you. I'm Robin Givhan for Washington Post Live.